What most people misunderstand about highly empathic individuals is that they are not fragile in the way people assume. They are not constantly overwhelmed, and they are not endlessly tolerant. What actually defines them is something far more precise. They are constantly scanning for emotional safety, even when they appear relaxed. They pick up patterns quickly, tone shifts, inconsistencies, delayed emotional alignment, subtle disrespect that others would miss or ignore, and most importantly, they track repetition. A single mistake rarely matters. A pattern always does. When people talk about empaths disappearing, they imagine a dramatic exit, an argument, a confrontation, a visible breaking point. That is not how it usually happens. The actual process is quieter, slower, and far more decisive. It begins when the nervous system starts associating a specific person with repeated internal discomfort. Not necessarily danger, not necessarily hostility, just a consistent drop in internal safety. That drop can come from many sources, but the most common ones are predictable. One of them is emotional invalidation that is subtle enough to be deniable. The empath expresses something genuine, and instead of being met with curiosity or acknowledgement, they are met with minimization. Not always outright rejection, but soft dismissal. Phrases that sound reasonable on the surface, but consistently reduce the emotional weight of what was shared. Over time, this creates a mismatch between expression and reception. The empath begins to learn that openness does not reliably produce understanding. When that learning repeats often enough, openness becomes expensive. Another source is emotional inconsistency. Not the normal inconsistency everyone has, but a specific pattern where warmth appears and disappears without explanation. One moment there is connection, attentiveness, and presence. The next moment there is detachment, distraction, or emotional absence. For most people, this creates mild confusion. For highly empathic individuals, it creates ongoing internal work. Their system tries to reconcile the difference. They ask internally, what changed? They try to locate the cause. They attempt to restore equilibrium by adjusting their own behavior. At first, they adapt. They become more careful, more attentive, more precise in communication. They start monitoring themselves more than usual, trying to reduce friction. This is the first stage that most people never notice. Self-adjustment. The empath does not leave. They optimize. They become quieter in certain areas, more selective in what they share, more observant before responding. They start testing emotional safety in small ways, without announcing it. They might share something slightly vulnerable and watch the response. They might express a mild concern and observe whether it is taken seriously or brushed aside. They are not testing to control the other person. They are testing to update internal models. If the response is consistently attuned, they relax. If the response is inconsistent, they begin to compartmentalize. Compartmentalization is where emotional distance begins to form, even while the relationship still looks normal externally. At this stage, nothing obvious has changed. Conversations still happen. Interaction still occurs. But internally, something important has already shifted. The empath is no longer fully inside the relationship. A portion of their attention has stepped back and started observing rather than participating. That observing part is crucial. It is where long-term decisions are made, because once someone begins observing a relationship instead of fully living inside it, the emotional bond is no longer being reinforced in the same way. What most people don't realize is that empaths do not typically leave because of a single event. They leave because the cost of staying gradually exceeds the value of engagement. And that cost is not external. It is internal. It is the constant emotional micro-adjustment required to maintain connection in an environment that does not consistently feel reciprocal. One of the strongest contributing behaviors that accelerates this withdrawal is emotional unpredictability paired with lack of repair. Every relationship has moments of disconnection. That is normal. What matters is what happens afterward. If there is misalignment and it is acknowledged, if there is tension and it is repaired, the system resets. Safety returns. The empath's nervous system updates. This connection can recover. But when misalignment is ignored, minimized, or deflected, something else happens. The unresolved moment does not disappear. It stays active in memory as an unfinished emotional loop. One loop is manageable. Multiple loops create accumulation. Accumulation changes perception. The person is no longer seen as a single consistent source of interaction. They become a collection of unresolved emotional events. At this point, the empath begins to conserve energy. They stop offering full emotional access. They stop volunteering deeper thoughts unless necessary. They begin to delay responses not out of strategy, but out of internal recalibration. Each interaction is processed with more caution. From the outside, this can look like distance. But internally, it is self-protection through reduction of exposure. Another factor that contributes to disappearance is emotional labor imbalance. In many relationships, one person gradually becomes the emotional regulator. They notice shifts, smooth tension, initiate repair, ask clarifying questions, and maintain connection stability. Empathic individuals are often placed into this role without it being explicitly assigned. At first, it feels natural. They are attuned, so they respond. They care, so they adjust. They understand nuance, so they compensate. But over time, this becomes unsustainable if it is not reciprocated. Because emotional regulation is not infinite. There is a threshold where the system recognizes that effort is flowing predominantly in one direction. Once that threshold is crossed, something subtle changes in internal prioritization. The empath begins to withdraw regulation effort first. They stop smoothing things over immediately. They stop interpreting vague behavior generously. They stop filling in emotional gaps that the other person leaves open. This is often the point where the relationship starts to feel colder to the other party. But what they are experiencing is not coldness. It is the removal of compensation. Another important dynamic is how empathic individuals respond to emotional incongruence. Incongruence is when words, tone, and behavior do not align. Most people tolerate a degree of this without much analysis. Empaths do not. They register it immediately, even if they do not act on it immediately. For example, someone may say they are fine, but their tone, timing, or nonverbal behavior suggests otherwise. Or someone may express care verbally, but their actions consistently fail to reflect it. Each instance of incongruence creates internal friction. The empath does not always confront it directly. Instead, they log it. And logging is important because it builds an internal dataset. Over time, this dataset becomes the basis for emotional recalibration. At some point, the accumulation of logged inconsistencies becomes stronger than the current positive signals in the relationship. That is when emotional withdrawal begins in earnest. Not as punishment, not as reaction, but as conclusion. There is also a phase where the empath begins reducing emotional accessibility without explanation. This is often misinterpreted by others as sudden change, but it is actually gradual restriction. They stop sharing certain thoughts. They stop initiating vulnerable conversations. They stop offering emotional insight freely. They begin responding, rather than contributing. This shift is subtle but decisive, because once emotional contribution stops flowing in both directions, the relationship transitions from connection-based to transaction-based, even if only on one side. At that stage, the empath is no longer investing in expansion. They are maintaining minimum necessary interaction while observing whether conditions improve. If conditions do not improve, another phase begins. Detachment without conflict. This is where most people become confused. They expect a breakup to involve confrontation, explanation, emotional release, or visible closure. But in many empath-driven withdrawals, none of that happens. Instead, communication gradually becomes shorter. Response times increase. Emotional tone flattens. Initiation decreases. The empath becomes less available not because they are trying to send a message, but because engagement no longer produces emotional reward. At the same time, they are already processing separation internally long before it becomes visible externally. This is why, when they finally disappear, it feels sudden to the other person. But it was not sudden. It was the final stage of a long internal disengagement process that had already completed before external behavior fully changed. One of the most misunderstood triggers for full withdrawal is repeated dismissal of emotional reality. Not disagreement. Dismissal. Disagreement can be healthy. Dismissal erases validity. When someone repeatedly experiences their internal state being treated as inaccurate, exaggerated, or unimportant, the result is not confrontation in most empathic individuals. It is withdrawal, because emotional reality is not negotiable in their internal system. If their emotional perception is consistently invalidated, they begin to treat the relationship as an unreliable environment for emotional truth. And once an environment is categorized as unreliable, access to deeper layers of self is restricted. At that point, the person you are interacting with is no longer fully present emotionally, even if they are physically still there. Another key factor is absence of emotional curiosity. Empaths naturally express curiosity about others. They ask questions. They explore meaning. They try to understand underlying emotional states. When that curiosity is not reciprocated, or when their own internal states are not met with similar interest, imbalance forms. Over time, they stop offering that level of curiosity outward, not because they lose capacity for it, but because they stop seeing it as relationally relevant. The connection becomes narrower, less exploratory, more functional. Eventually, the system reaches a point where continued interaction no longer justifies emotional investment. At that point, disappearance is not a decision made in a single moment. It is the final expression of a long series of internal recalibrations that have already resolved the question of whether the relationship is sustainable. And once that resolution is reached internally, external presence becomes optional rather than necessary. So when they finally go quiet, it is not retreat in the emotional sense. It is completion of a process that started long before anyone noticed anything was changing. Once that internal decision forms, what follows is not chaos. It is structure. People often imagine emotional withdrawal as something unstable, like drifting or confusion. But in empathic individuals, it is usually the opposite. It becomes organized, quiet, and increasingly intentional without ever being announced as intention. The first visible sign is the reduction of emotional elasticity in conversations. Earlier, they might have adapted easily to mood shifts in others. They would absorb tension, translate meaning, soften edges, and maintain flow even when the interaction was uneven. After withdrawal begins, that elasticity weakens. Not abruptly, gradually. They stop stretching themselves to bridge emotional gaps that others create. If a conversation becomes dry, it stays dry. If it becomes superficial, it remains superficial. If it becomes emotionally inconsistent, they no longer attempt to stabilize it. This is often misread as detachment, but internally it is boundary enforcement through absence of compensation. Another shift occurs in attentional investment. Empathic individuals tend to allocate a significant portion of their awareness to microsignals in others: tone, hesitation, facial expression, rhythm changes in speech, and emotional subtext. This constant scanning is part of what makes them so attuned in the first place. But when withdrawal begins, that scanning does not disappear. It gets deprioritized. They still notice things, but they no longer build meaning around them. This distinction is critical. Observation without interpretation changes everything, because once interpretation stops, emotional engagement stops feeding on uncertainty. And without uncertainty being emotionally processed, the connection loses one of its primary psychological fuels. At this stage, the other person may still behave exactly the same, but the empath is no longer constructing internal narratives that sustain emotional closeness. The relationship becomes more literal, more surface level, less psychologically interactive. Another important development is the collapse of anticipatory care. In healthy connection, empathic individuals often anticipate needs before they are expressed. They notice discomfort early and respond preemptively. They adjust tone, timing, and presence to maintain harmony. During withdrawal, this anticipatory system shuts down selectively. They no longer move first. They wait. Not as a tactic, but as a reallocation of effort. If something needs attention, it must now be expressed explicitly. If something is unclear, it is no longer internally resolved on behalf of the other person. This creates a noticeable shift in relational experience for the other party. Even if they cannot articulate it precisely, the relationship begins to feel less supported, less held, more effortful. But what they are actually experiencing is the removal of invisible maintenance work that was never acknowledged in the first place. There is also a phase where emotional memory becomes compartmentalized rather than integrated. Normally, empathic individuals weave emotional experiences into a continuous internal narrative. Positive and negative moments are both stored, compared, and used to refine relational understanding. During withdrawal, negative emotional data stops being balanced by compensatory reinterpretation, meaning good moments no longer erase or soften the impact of repeated friction. Everything is stored more neutrally, less emotionally edited, more structurally factual. This leads to a shift in internal weighting. The relationship is no longer remembered as a blend of highs and lows. It becomes a record of patterns, and patterns are far more decisive than isolated experiences. Another subtle but powerful change is the disappearance of emotional testing. Earlier stages often involve small tests of safety, sharing something vulnerable, expressing mild dissatisfaction, or offering emotional openness to see how it is received. Once withdrawal has progressed, these tests stop entirely. Not because trust has been rebuilt, but because testing itself is no longer considered worthwhile. This is a critical threshold. When someone stops testing emotional safety, it usually means they have stopped expecting improvement. At that point, interaction becomes maintenance only. Communication continues, but exploration ends. Another layer involves how empathic individuals handle internal conflict about leaving. Contrary to common belief, they do not typically experience dramatic emotional oscillation at the final stage. Instead, there is a long period of internal resolution followed by a relatively stable decision state. Before that point, there may be confusion, rationalization, and repeated attempts to restore balance. But once enough data has been gathered, the system simplifies. It stops debating. It stops reopening the question. It stops re-evaluating the same patterns that have already been processed multiple times. This reduction in internal debate is often mistaken for emotional numbness, but it is actually cognitive closure. The question has already been answered internally, even if external behavior has not yet fully aligned with it. This is why others often miss the transition entirely. They are still engaging with the in-process version of the person, while internally the decision-making process has already completed. Another important aspect is the shift in how presence is distributed. Before withdrawal, empathic individuals are fully present in interactions, meaning their dead attention is aligned with the moment and the emotional context of the other person. After withdrawal begins, presence becomes partial. Part of their attention remains engaged, while another part remains detached and observational. This split creates a noticeable change in interaction quality. Even if everything appears normal on the surface, responses may still be appropriate, timing may still be correct, words may still be accurate, but the emotional resonance behind them is reduced, and resonance is often what people actually respond to, more than content itself. When resonance declines, interactions start to feel flatter, even if nothing objectively wrong is happening. This flattening is one of the earliest externally detectable signs that withdrawal is already well underway. Another stage involves reduced emotional repair attempts. In earlier phases, empathic individuals often initiate repair after tension. They clarify misunderstandings. They soften misunderstandings. They re-establish connection after distance. But once withdrawal crosses a certain threshold, repair attempts become minimal or non-existent. Not because conflict is desired, but because repair effort is no longer internally justified. At that point, the emotional system is no longer investing in restoration. It is investing in preservation of remaining internal equilibrium. And preservation requires energy conservation, not relational maintenance. This is where the quiet disappearance becomes most visible. From the outside, it can look like they are slowly fading. Less initiation, less emotional engagement, less responsiveness. But internally, it is not fading. It is consolidation. The emotional system is reorganizing itself around reduced external dependency. There is also an important psychological reversal that occurs at this stage. Earlier in the relationship, the empath may have been the one absorbing emotional variability, interpreting ambiguity, and maintaining coherence. After withdrawal, that role reverses. Now the other person is left to interpret the empath's reduced signals, while the empath no longer interprets theirs. This creates asymmetry. And asymmetry in emotional interpretation is one of the strongest drivers of perceived distance. People begin to feel that they are not reaching the other person anymore, not because access is blocked aggressively, but because interpretive effort is no longer being matched. Eventually, a final phase emerges, where interaction becomes almost entirely contextual, rather than emotional. Communication still happens when necessary. Responses still occur when required. But the underlying emotional system that once animated the relationship is no longer actively participating. At this point, what remains externally is a form of presence without attachment. And that is the stage most people recognize only in hindsight, because it does not announce itself. It does not escalate. It does not argue. It does not declare ending. It simply stops reinforcing what used to be there, until eventually there is nothing left to reinforce at all.